The second season of Feud covers the legendary falling out between writer Truman Capote and the group of glamorous socialites he called the Swans. It all began when a chapter of his then upcoming book Answered Prayers was published in Esquire magazine in 1975, and it was glaringly obvious who some of the most unflattering characters were based on. After a long absence from publishing, Capote's comeback was promised to be his best yet, a social exposé masterpiece he described as a non-fiction novel, and he hoped would be the American equivalent of Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. In an interview with People magazine, he presented the book as a weapon. There's the handle, the trigger, the barrel, and finally the bullet, and when the bullet is fired from the gun, it's going to come out with a speed and power like you've never seen. Wham! This literary weapon attacked the women who'd considered themselves his close friends, sometimes for more than 20 years. Marital affairs, the vanity and pettiness of the rich, and even a murder were all mocked in Cote Basque 1965, the short story that was intended to be the first chapter of Answered Prayers. After its publication, Capote's former friends ostracised him, and he never socially recovered, nor did he finish Answered Prayers, which was published posthumously in 1984. Today I will explore the lives of the 5 women who will be portrayed in Capote versus the Swans. By 1975, Truman Capote had known some of his swans for over 20 years. They adored him for his witty intellect, they confided in him about the most intimate details of their lives, and his celebrity made him an interesting ornament to their social circle. The Swans was a nickname Capote gave to the elegant socialites he befriended, but not every woman considered a swan will be discussed in this video. Over time, Capote's social circle changed, and who was a swan did too, and not all of them even liked the title. Some felt it was condescending, others readily embraced it. Swans have long been associated with wealth and power. The elegant birds are poised and graceful, but competitive and dangerous too if you get in their way. A perfect term to describe the women who fascinated and inspired Capote. The leader of the group, and one of the most prominent socialites in New York during the mid-20th century, was Babe Paley, and Capote said of her, she had only one fault, she was perfect. Other than that, she was perfect. She was born Barbara Cushing on July 5, 1915, the youngest of her parents' 5 children. Her father, Harvey Cushing, was an extremely successful and pioneering brain surgeon. Cushing's disease is named after him, and he served as a professor at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and Yale universities. Babe inherited both of her parents' self-discipline and focus, the elegance and warmth of her mother, and the career-driven personality of her father. Her mother, Kate, was an expert hostess, and organised the household and her children's lives down to the tiniest detail. Her greatest ambition was to see her 3 daughters make advantageous marriages. These equally elegant young ladies were collectively known as the fabulous Cushing sisters. The middle daughter, Betsy, was the first to make a good match when she married James Roosevelt, the son of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. After a marriage of 10 years, they divorced, and Betsy married again into the Whitney family. Her second husband, John, was the American ambassador to the United Kingdom. Eldest daughter Mary married William Vincent Astor, and after their divorce, she married again to painter and art collector James Whitney Fosburgh. Each of the Cushing sisters had 2 marriages to their name, but Babe, who was thought to be the most beautiful of the trio and on whom her mother's highest hopes rested, seemed the least inclined to marriage. After graduating from the prestigious Westover Prep School in Connecticut in 1933, 18-year-old Babe debuted into society the following year, and was among the most popular of that year's Boston debutantes. Even during the Great Depression, no expense was spared in making sure she had a successful season, and she attended as many coming-out parties in Boston and New York as possible. She must have attracted many admirers, and it was said of her that, so great is her beauty that no matter how often I see her, each time is the first time. But by the end of her first season, that beauty had nearly been destroyed. On the ride home from a party, she got into a horrendous car accident that disfigured her face so badly she was almost unrecognisable, and most of her teeth were knocked out. Her recovery was slow and involved extensive reconstructive surgery, but despite having to wear false teeth, she returned to society more gorgeous than ever, and nobody except her close friends and family even knew what had happened. She enjoyed 2 successful seasons, but was far more interested in pursuing a career in fashion than getting married, much to her mother's worry. She moved to America's social capital, New York, and began working at Glamour magazine. Her impeccable taste made her a perfect fit for the city's fashionable elite, and by the end of the 1930s, she was a fashion editor at Vogue, known as one of the most beautiful women in New York, and still unmarried. The wealthy women who worked at Vogue and other glamorous publications often weren't even paid that much, but they didn't care, as it added to their status and allowed them to be surrounded by expensive beauty. Babe often posed for fashion photographers and made her way into the pages of Vogue, yet her upper-class background and social standing never made her a snob, and she was effortlessly generous to even those far beneath her on the social ladder. At last, in late 1940, at the ripe old age of 25, she married Stanley Grafton Mortimer Jr., the grandson of one of the founders of Standard Oil. The newlyweds moved into a triplex apartment in Manhattan, although much of their time was spent in Tuxedo Park, a village about 40 miles outside of the city, inhabited by only the finest families New York had to offer. Everyone was wealthy, but the most important thing was to have the right kind of wealth, old money, and the Mortimers were among the best Tuxedo families. During the Second World War, her husband enlisted in the Navy and trained in Pensacola, Florida, which Babe could not stand. She stayed there for a short while before returning to New York, continuing her role as editor at Vogue, with only short breaks during her 2 pregnancies. Her first marriage only lasted until 1946. Babe's main interest was still her career and the café society lifestyle she had become accustomed to, and by her own children's accounts, she was not close with them. In 1941, Babe was voted the second best-dressed woman in the world after Wallis Simpson, and she was on the list again in 1945 and 1946, before being inducted into the International Best Dressed List Hall of Fame in 1958. During her years at Vogue, she was often given designer clothes for free as a kind of unofficial brand ambassador. Designers knew that if she showed up to an event or posed in their clothes for a photograph, she had the power to lend her glamour and status to their brand. When she did buy clothes, they were only the best. She bought entire Valentino and Givenchy couture collections, and paired her outfits with extravagant jewellery. On a few occasions, she became a trendsetter, most famously when millions of women tied scarves around the handle of their handbags after Babe did it simply because her scarf had become too warm for her. Babe was married again a year after her divorce to William Paley, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants and a practically self-made millionaire. Babe's mother disliked these facts until she realised just how wealthy her new son-in-law was. William Paley, who was known as Bill, seemed like a good choice for a second husband. New money and in charge of it himself, not dependent on relatives or a trust fund, he had built up a relatively small radio network into the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS, and had become fabulously rich in the process. Now his entry into old money society was secured by marriage. Divorce had not diminished the fact that Babe, with her impeccable social credentials, beauty and class, was a catch. It was Paley who pursued her, despite the fact he was still married to his first wife. Babe went on her first trip outside America in late 1946, on an assignment from Vogue, and when she returned, Bill gave her an apartment, and when she fell ill and was hospitalized for a month, he visited her every day. In July of 1947, Bill was finally divorced, and 5 days later he married Babe at her mother's estate in a very private fashion. They went on a lavish European honeymoon before settling down to married life, dividing their attention between an apartment at the St. Regis Hotel and the 80-acre Kaluna farm outside New York. The Paleys had 2 children, the first a son born only 8 months after the wedding. Babe left her job at Vogue shortly after her marriage, but was still regularly seen in its pages. While mid-century celebrities such as singers and actresses are still remembered today, the largely forgotten fashion icons were just as influential to all stratas of society. Babe adored the media attention and loved the camera as much as it loved her, but even she felt the pressure of the image of absolute perfection she had created. Never a hair out of place, she had to devote most of her time to maintaining her appearance, as photographers were ready wherever she went. She had 2 more children with her second husband, but like him, had little time for them. While he was busy with work, Babe was occupied with maintaining her social status, and attending to her husband's every need. But despite this, he was unfaithful to her, and their marriage often tested Babe's endurance. She would visit her sister Betsy's neighbouring country estate in tears, but for the public she put on the show that hers was the perfect marriage, and privately consoled herself with overseeing her children's upbringing from afar and planning elaborate gardening schemes at her estate, as well as endless rounds of entertaining. Her celebrity had only grown by the 1960s, while her relationships with both her husband and children had deteriorated. By this time, however, she had found a new emotional outlet, and that was her close friendship with Truman Capote. The Paleys and Capote had met through mutual friends in the mid-1950s, by which time Capote had established himself as the darling of New York's literary and social scene. From the earliest days of Babe and Truman's friendship, it was clear they were kindred spirits and fascinated by one another. They shared similar inner pain, carefully concealed from the outside world, and for Babe, who all her life had been taught to hide her true feelings and present a perfect image, it must have been incredibly refreshing to have one person with whom she could let the mask slip. The trio of the Paleys plus Capote soon became a familiar sight, as the couple brought him on trips abroad that even their children were absent from. Retrospectively, it wasn't the best idea to make one's most intimate friend a writer known for being a scathingly witty gossip, but considering the silent endurance of Babe's life and all the social pressures that surrounded her, it's easy to see how she could become almost addicted to the comfort of having someone to confide in. In fact, most of his swans made the same mistake. Truman adored gossip, usually of the detailed, sensual nature. He knew about all the illicit goings-on of Manhattan's elite, and if a juicy detail escaped his attention, the Swans were quite pleased with themselves to be able to inform him of it. And yet, in the midst of such a gossiper, it seems they didn't consider he could be sharing their secrets as he did everyone else's. In Babe's case, her second marriage, which she had hoped would be a love match, quickly turned into a business arrangement. Her husband wanted a connection to the old guard and fashionable upper classes of New York, and she wanted wealth to support her lifestyle. Bill Paley could be stingy, except when it came to making himself look good, and that included buying his wife the finest of everything so she would be the perfect ornament to his status. Truman, on the other hand, showed special favour to Babe simply for herself, it seemed. Of course he enjoyed being around the rich and famous, but above all he loved beauty and style. Babe's platonic relationship with Capote was in some ways far deeper than with her husband and definitely than with her children. He helped her expand her literary education, and she gave him decorating advice and sometimes helped him financially, before the success of his 1966 book In Cold Blood secured his financial independence. Babe told Truman everything about her life, her husband's roving eye and that he had abandoned their marriage bed. She was envied and adored for her beauty, and yet it seemed her husband only wanted her as a symbol of his own social standing. She never seemed to consider Truman would betray these confidences, even when he shared the secrets of all the other women in their friend group. None of these women told Babe that her private life was actually being gossiped about by Truman, and until the infamous Cote Basque 1965 publication, they were all naively none the wiser to his betrayals. After the financial success of In Cold Blood, and at the zenith point of his popularity, Capote decided to hold a masquerade ball, like the grand events of the past, at the Plaza Hotel on the 28th of November 1966. Well over 500 people were invited to the black and white ball, which was held in honour of Katharine Graham, the leader of the family that owned the Washington Post, who Truman had met through Babe. The ball, where every guest came dressed in black and white, was a great success and has been called the party of the century. Babe looked as glamorous as ever, and another swan, Gloria Guinness, was bedridden for the next 2 days from the neck pain she suffered from wearing 2 huge necklaces, one with rubies and the other with diamonds. As the 1960s drew on, Babe grew increasingly depressed and relied on Truman even more to be a shoulder to sometimes literally cry on. She and her husband were almost totally estranged from their children, except for Babe's son Tony, with whom she had a close relationship that her husband resented. She was forced to treat her marriage like a job, the role of Mrs. Paley that she had to play, because what choice did she have? Bill bought a Fifth Avenue apartment that overlooked Central Park, and the task of decorating it was monumental. Babe hired no less than 4 of the best decorators to help her, and when that was done, she had to manage a team of staff and was expected to regularly entertain guests. While residing at the St. Regis apartment that consisted of only a few rooms, the hotel staff had always known what to do without Babe's help, and due to its smaller size, the Paleys had rarely entertained there. Perhaps her husband hoped the lavish apartment would make her happy, another sign of how little he understood her, as this new responsibility only added to her already extensive workload. Her expensive lifestyle and even her problems may seem enviable at first glance, but looking at her daily schedule, one gets the sense that she never had a moment to herself and was under constant pressure, stress and scrutiny from all sides, without many true friends. When she was in the city, her day consisted of endless rounds of lunches, charity meetings, shopping that she had gotten down to a science, and organising her households. Everything in her life ultimately came down to her decision, and her husband gave her little thanks for it. In the early 1970s, it was becoming apparent her health was declining. She had faced serious health problems before, yet never slowed down when it was advisable to do so. The pressures she faced led her to rely strongly on nicotine. Sometimes she smoked 2 packets of cigarettes in a day. She relied on her friendships as a source of strength and support, but the backstabbing was not limited to Truman. Gloria Guinness invited Babe to events, telling her to dress simply, and when she arrived, Babe would find everyone else in formal attire, and Gloria, of course, outshining them all. Nevertheless, Babe was a devoted friend and very generous. She would often send presents to people who she didn't even know that well, and she shopped all year round for the perfect Christmas gifts, putting a lot of thought into what each person would really appreciate. In 1973, the Paleys went on a whirlwind tour of China, cramming in so much tourism that Babe fell ill with a fever of over 100 degrees, which led to pneumonia. She followed the doctor's advice to quit smoking, but in 1974 she was diagnosed with lung cancer, and after 2 extensive surgeries, her strength was wavering and she never recovered her old pace of life. Still a perfectionist, even when facing death, she set about planning every detail of her funeral and will. Among the small social circles she still made the effort to see was Truman Capote, who visited her frequently and remained a supportive comfort to her right up until the publication of Cote Basque 1965 in November of 1975. Babe Paley is the wife of a Jewish businessman in the story. The businessman is conducting an affair behind her back that is described in crude detail and mirrors a real affair of Bill Paley's that caused Babe great pain. Capote no doubt embellished the real story, but it was still easily identifiable as Babe's life. She and her family were very private people. Babe had been raised to never let the skeletons out of the closet publicly, no matter what, and now the most painful and intimate details of her marriage were there in print for anyone to read. Gossiping among friends was one thing, but now each one of them was being openly mocked. Babe immediately dropped Truman and rang around her circle, telling them to do the same. Almost overnight, Truman had been dumped by his Swans, and while some defended him, he would never enjoy the same popularity in society again. Babe died in 1978, but her legacy as a fashion icon lives on. She is portrayed by Naomi Watts in Feud Season 2. There was another death just before the publication of Cote Basque 1965 that is even rumoured to have been caused by it. Anne Woodward was not a swan, but she is a central character in Capote vs. the Swans, and Truman's mockery of her was perhaps the worst of all the people portrayed in Answered Prayers, and the rumour of its publication may have even caused her to end her own life. Anne Woodward's name was originally Evangeline Lucille Cromwell, and she was born in the same year as Babe Paley on December 12, 1915. Ironically, if it is true that he played a part in her eventual demise, Anne had a lot in common with Truman. Both were from the South, both had divorced parents, and struggled in their youth, eager to climb their way up the social ladder. Anne's father was an ex-military officer who worked as a streetcar conductor in Detroit, and her mother Ethel was an ambitious and independent woman who got a sociology degree and became the principal of a high school before starting her own taxicab business during the Depression. She was the one to initiate the divorce, which must have happened early in Anne's life, as some sources say her father did not see her from the time she was 8 years old until around 1955. Anne may have been inspired by her mother's independence in one way, but she was surely eager to move on to better things, and perhaps she already knew her looks were the road to the life she wanted. She reinvented herself for the first time when she moved to Kansas City and changed her name to Anne Eden, hoping to use her good looks to her advantage as a model. In 1937 she moved on to New York and signed to the John Robert Powers modelling agency. She held down multiple jobs as a model, stage and radio actress, as well as a showgirl, and in 1940 she was voted the most beautiful girl in radio. She worked as a chorus girl at a nightclub during this time and caught the eye of William Woodward Sr., a wealthy banker who was decades older than Anne and bored with his marriage. He may have made Anne his mistress. He was not, however, the Woodward she married. It was his son, also called William, 5 years younger than Anne, who was apparently set up with her by his own father. Anne and Woodward Jr. married in 1943, and she enjoyed the high life she had always wanted in New York City, while he distinguished himself as a naval officer fighting in the South Pacific. William Woodward Jr. was tall, handsome, and a graduate of Harvard. Before his marriage, he was considered by some to be the most eligible bachelor in America, and as his father's only son, he stood to inherit a considerable fortune that included the Bel Air stud farm, one of, if not the, most outstanding breeders in the country at the time. Anne may have done incredibly well for herself, but it was hard to enjoy high society when she was shunned by it. Her own mother-in-law thought she was nothing more than a gold digger, and the Manhattan elite weren't going to let a country showgirl into their ranks too easily. Her husband's return from the war made things a little easier socially, but privately their marriage was unstable. They both liked to drink, adding fuel to their bitter and sometimes public arguments that would often come to blows, and they had numerous affairs. They had 2 children together, but by 1947 William Jr. asked for a divorce, which Anne refused to give him. With Woodward Sr.'s death in 1953, William Jr. had become incredibly wealthy and still wanted a divorce. By this time, Anne was a leading figure in society and had grown used to a luxurious lifestyle she was not going to let go of easily. The Woodwards had a country estate in the fashionable Oyster Bay in Long Island, and they returned there on the night of October 30th, 1955, after attending a party held in the honour of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, where they may have gotten a little drunk. Both the Woodwards enjoyed hunting and were good shots. They kept guns in the house and had recently been concerned by reports of burglaries in the neighbourhood. The couple slept in separate bedrooms, and that night Anne mistook her husband for a burglar, or so she said, and shot him twice with a shotgun. He was dead by the time the police arrived, and the tragedy was called the shooting of the century by Life magazine. Anne was never indicted, and the court ruled the shooting an accident. Her case was helped by her own mother-in-law's testimony, and by a burglar who testified he had actually been on the Woodwards' roof intending to rob them when he heard the gunshots and left. She was immediately ostracised from society, and many people believed she had murdered her husband because he intended to divorce her and give her nothing. She apparently encountered Truman Capote for the first time in Switzerland. Anne had retreated to Europe where she was less well known, and her remaining finances allowed her to mix in society to some degree. Capote spotted her having dinner in a restaurant, and no doubt with a sense of mischief went over to talk to her. She was annoyed by him and allegedly insulted him, to which he responded by calling her Mrs. Bang Bang, a nickname that stuck. In Cote Basque 1965, Anne Woodward appears as Anne Hopkins, a gold digger and a bigamist described as a malicious-looking Betty Grable. Anne Hopkins decides to kill her husband when he plans to divorce her after discovering a first marriage she never had annulled. Anne Hopkins is described in extremely insulting terms in this story, and one wonders if there were other personal reasons besides their meeting in Switzerland for Truman to single Anne out so harshly. In Anne Woodward, a social climber who was just as much enthralled by beautiful people in society as Truman was, did he see too much of himself? She came from virtually nothing and had dreamed of being wealthy and glamorous since her youth, so had he. She had managed to break into a different strata of society and would do anything to avoid returning to her origins, so would he. Perhaps this is a case of people hating those who remind them of themselves. Anne Woodward did not live to read those cruel words. A month before they hit print, she ended her own life by cyanide poisoning, and it is thought she was at least partly motivated by the rumour of her inclusion in Capote's soon-to-be-published latest work. The tragedy of the Woodward family did not end there. In 1976, Anne's younger son James also ended his own life, and her other son William did the same in 1999. Another theory for Anne's motivations in death was that her sons believed she had killed their father. But like her reasons for ending her life, the truth of whether or not Anne intended to shoot her husband is only known to her. Aside from their own personal secrets being shared, the Swans took offence at Anne's portrayal. It was harsh, vulgar and scandalous, and one wonders how Capote did not anticipate this reaction from them. Anne Woodward is portrayed by Demi Moore in Feud, and in 1985 Dominic Dunne wrote a book based on the Woodward shooting called The Two Mrs. Grenvilles, which was adapted into a TV miniseries in 1987. Our next swan is the main inspiration behind the narrator of all these terrible stories in Cote Basque 1965. Lady Inna Coolberth tells Jonesy, a character based on Capote himself, all of society's secrets over lunch in the fashionable the Cote Basque restaurant in New York. Lady Inna Coolberth is supposedly Slim Keith, a style icon, socialite and all-American beauty known as the original California girl. Slim was born in California in 1917 and called Mary Ray Gross until her mother changed her name to Nancy. She was the second of 3 children and grew up in Pacific Grove. An early connection to fame for Slim was the fact her family knew author John Steinbeck's parents, and Slim enjoyed climbing on their roof to play. The first few years of Slim's childhood were made bearable by the efforts of her kind and gentle mother. Slim's father, Edward, was feared by both his wife and children. He would punish all 3 of them even if only one child had done something wrong, and otherwise he treated his whole family with indifference. That was until the tragic death of his only son, Buddy, who at age 8 died of the burns he sustained after his nightshirt caught fire while he warmed himself by the hearth. All of Edward Gross's rage and grief was taken out on his wife, who he blamed for his only son and heir's death. The household was so miserable that the 2 remaining daughters, Slim, who was 12, and Theodora, who was 16, were sent to a convent boarding school 100 miles away. Theodora had become icy and mean after her brother's death, and when she wasn't completely ignoring her sister, she publicly ridiculed and bullied her. Slim hated her sister and was determined to one day outshine Theodora in beauty and popularity. Slim's family completely disintegrated when the girls came back home after Theodora's graduation to find their father had moved out. Theodora followed suit unexpectedly, having all her things packed and taken out of the house in an hour, never to return. She went on to ingratiate herself with her father. Slim was sent to another convent school where she made friends and did well academically, and it was there that she saw her father for what would be the last time for many years to come. He came to convince her to move in with him so he could accuse her mother of being an unfit parent and give her nothing in the divorce. He tried to bribe Slim with the offer of buying her clothes, a car, even a boat, but she remained loyal to her mother. Thanks to her loyalty, her mother was able to get a fair settlement that provided mother and daughter with enough to live on. They never spoke to Theodora again. Slim occasionally saw her across the room at events, and on Theodora's wedding day, Slim drove her mother to the church so that they could secretly watch Theodora come out in her wedding dress, because they had not been invited. In her teenage years, Slim blossomed from an awkward adolescent into an attractive young woman. She had become accomplished at swimming, riding, dancing, and tennis, and during her senior year at the convent school, she became restless for an adventure. In her most glamorous clothes, Slim set out across the desert in the yellow Packard roadster her mother had bought her, which she called the Flying Omelette. Her destination was a hotel and winter resort called the Furnace Creek Inn, and during her time there she became friends with various celebrities, including actor William Powell, who gave her the nickname Slim because of her lanky physique. By the time she was 19, Slim was enjoying LA's nightlife and had become acquainted with William Randolph Hearst and his mistress Marion Davies. Slim often stayed at their castle and even went on a trip to Mexico with them. Slim finally convinced her mother to move with her to Los Angeles, and it was there she met her future husband, famous director Howard Hawks. At first he assumed that, like all pretty girls in Hollywood, Slim wanted to be an actress, and while she had briefly entertained the idea of being a singer, she had no desire to act. Howard was over 20 years older than her, and still married to Atholi, the sister of Norma Shearer, when he and Slim started dating. But because of Atholi's mental health problems, he wanted to divorce her. It took 3 years for this to finally happen, in which time Slim hung around the sets of all Howard's films and became friends with some of the biggest stars of the time, including Cary Grant, Gary Cooper, Rosalind Russell, and also through Howard, she came to know Ernest Hemingway, who would continue to influence her literary tastes and outlook on life throughout their 30-year friendship. Slim was fascinated by the movie business, and after their marriage became Howard's script reader, deciding what was worth his time. Slim soon learned that Howard was an expert storyteller both in his professional and personal lives. He created elaborate tales of his own adventures, some of them grounded in truth, but nevertheless heavily embellished. He was an expert flyer, a master yachtsman. He found treasure while diving in Honolulu. The list of his lies went on, and every time he told a story to new people, it changed slightly. He was also strangely extravagant. Slim wanted 1 dog, Howard brought home 8. He ruinously gambled at the races and ordered 12 suits at a time. Not long after their marriage, Howard began to have affairs, but it was his coldness and self-centered nature that ended up destroying the marriage. Slim's life, however, looked glamorous and enviable from the outside. When Lauren Bacall, then called Betty, saw Slim's house for the first time, she was overawed by its beauty and opulence. Lauren was there for a photo shoot and she wore Slim's clothes for it. It was thanks to Slim that Lauren's career began. She had been a model in New York City and appeared on the cover of Harper's Bazaar, which Slim saw and showed Howard, who immediately contacted his agent to find more about Lauren. She came down to Hollywood to do a screen test and ended up starring alongside Humphrey Bogart in To Have and Have Not, which Howard adapted from the novel of the same name by Ernest Hemingway. In the movie, Lauren's character is nicknamed Slim, and much of her style and personality takes inspiration from Slim Keith. Slim modelled for fashion magazines, often in her own clothes, in order to keep herself busy, and in 1946 she gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Kitty. Howard already had 3 children and showed no interest in Slim during the pregnancy or when their daughter was born. Slim decided to go on a brief holiday to clear her head, and ended up being invited to Cuba by Hemingway after she explained the state of her marriage to him. It was during that trip that she met Leland Hayward, the man who would be her second husband, who was a theatrical producer at the time. Leland got her a job working as overseer of the costume department of a play he produced. In 1947, Slim and Leland both filed for divorces and had to wait a year for them to be finalised and leave the couple free to marry. In between her divorce and second marriage, Slim was courted by Clark Gable, who had been attracted to her for some time, but despite his determination, Slim remained loyal to Leland. They were married on June 10th of 1949 at Babe and William Paley's Kaluna estate. They divorced in 1960 when Leland left Slim for Pamela Churchill, but nevertheless Slim described her second marriage as the happiest years of her life. This time was not without struggle, however. Slim desperately wanted another child, but after suffering from miscarriages and one child dying in the womb at 7 months, she couldn't take the pain of another failed pregnancy and gave up trying. In 1951, Leland and Slim bought a house in Manhasset, Long Island, and also had an apartment in New York. Leland had known Bill Paley for some time, and Slim became friends with Babe. The first time she ever saw Babe, she thought to herself, "Well, Slim, you're not number one, she is." Slim described Babe as the best woman she'd ever known, and the best female friend she ever had. Slim's life was always interesting in the 1950s. Leland produced some of the biggest Broadway hits of the time, such as South Pacific and The Sound of Music, and he was still involved in the movie business, bringing more stars into their lives. Amidst all the glamour, Slim struggled to be an effective stepmother to Leland's 3 children from his first marriage. The younger 2, Bridget and Billy, proved to be a challenge. Bridget had many mental health problems and for some time suffered from undiagnosed epilepsy. Billy had a very high IQ but lacked the support and opportunity around him to use it healthily. Slim loved them deeply, but she knew they needed professional help. Billy was committed to a psychiatric institute in California when he was 16. He spent 3 years there and briefly escaped. Bridget was also put into a psychiatric institute when her seizures became too much for her to deal with. She remained there for 2 years and overdosed on her epilepsy medication at age 21. During this time, a welcome escape for Slim was her friendship with Truman Capote. She enjoyed the fun of his company just as much as Babe Paley, but unlike Babe, Slim never gossiped to Truman, and she told him frankly she would never confide in him because she didn't trust him. She advised her good friend Babe to take whatever Truman said with a pinch of salt and not to tell him anything private or intimate, but Babe, as we have learned, did not listen. During the course of their more than 25-year-long friendship, which began in the early 1950s, Slim and Truman had many adventures, including going on a visit to Russia with Cary Grant. When Truman was writing In Cold Blood, he wanted Slim to be his agent to sell the film rights. He said she could use the job to make tax write-offs, which was helpful because she was in between marriages at the time and could use the extra money. During her time as his agent, she turned down offers of $300,000 for the film rights because she was sure it was worth $1 million. When she married Baron Kenneth Keith of Castleacre in 1962 and went to live in England, she set Truman up with a new agent who did sell the script for $1 million, and Slim got her cut too. Her third husband, Kenneth Keith, was a banker who was made a life peer in 1980, which in England is the creation of a title that cannot be inherited. Slim divided her time between living in London and at the Wicken estate in Castleacre, Norfolk, a property that boasted 2,500 acres of farmland. She took charge of renovating the Wicken, but found English society a challenge. Slim still frequented New York society, but saw a different side to Truman after he suffered a particularly bad breakup. He became more devious than ever in his pranks, inviting Pamela Churchill, the woman Leland had left Slim for, to a lunch with Slim and Babe Paley. He loved creating awkward situations that might result in catfights, and starting rumours just for fun. He focused on work less than ever now he had money, but spoke often of Answered Prayers, the book he hoped would cement his place among the greats of literature and immortalise him. He had been working on it since at least the late 1950s, yet the Swans never expected he would betray them. They thought his pranks were all in good fun, and none was more shocked than Slim when she read Cote Basque 1965. Truman's betrayal of her was particularly hurtful. In the case of his other friends, they had gossiped about each other and told Capote too much about themselves. But Slim, with wise forethought, had refused to, and yet she seemed to be the sole inspiration behind Lady Inner Coolberth, the character who is an endless fountain of gossip in Cote Basque 1965. Slim was perplexed by this, and also at how comparatively crass and poor the writing quality was in this story, compared to the artful subtlety of Truman's other work. Just as with her sister, Slim saw Truman across the room at events, but she never spoke a word to him again. In 1972, her third and last marriage ended in divorce, and she died in New York in 1990 at the age of 72. She is portrayed by Diane Lane in Capote vs. the Swans. Our next swan is C.Z. Guest, muse to photographers, artists and designers, the ultimate icon of simplistic American elegance. Truman Capote called her the cool vanilla lady, and she was one of the few swans to stand by him after Cote Basque. She was born into the upper echelons of Boston society on the 19th of February 1920. She was one of 4 children, and her birth name was Lucy Douglas Cochrane, but she gave herself the initials CZ after her brother nicknamed her Sissy because he could not pronounce sister. Her father, Alexander, was an investment banker, but died when CZ was 6. She grew up in a mansion with 40 rooms and made a very successful debut into society at age 17 in 1937. The ballroom at her coming-out party was decorated to resemble Paris. She became interested in charity during that time, which would number among her many lifelong interests. Another passion that started young was gardening. As a child, she trailed after the gardener at her family estate while he worked, and in later life she would write multiple books on gardening and develop an insect repellent. CZ said that, "I've always felt having a garden is like having a good and loyal friend." She was classy and serene, just as happy at a party as she was tending to her shrubs. But she had a wild side too. In 1939 she won a contest to be the glamour girl of the Massachusetts North Shore, and subsequently followed in her mother's footsteps with a brief stint as a showgirl. She even went to Hollywood and studied acting at the 20th Century Fox Studio School, but never made a movie, although it was rumoured she dated Errol Flynn. She was briefly a Ziegfeld Follies girl in a Broadway revival that happened in 1944, and the year prior she was part of a revue on the roof of the Ritz-Carlton in Boston. The first artist she provided inspiration for was the Mexican socialist Diego Rivera. She went down to Mexico and posed for him nude. Later, CZ's husband bought the portrait that had apparently been hanging in a bar in Mexico City. Other artists that she served as a muse to were Andy Warhol and Salvador Dali, and she provided the perfect subject for photographer Slim Aarons, whose striking colour photos of her at her mother-in-law's Palm Beach villa are among his most famous work. Slim Aarons' photos capture a specific breed of Americana, the fabulously rich and stylish people who were celebrities in mid-century America purely for being themselves. CZ personifies this era absolutely, with her chic, simplistic looks and aura of serenity and self-assurance. Her taste was specific and didn't follow along with trends, instead choosing to favour designers like Manbocker and Givenchy, whose designs were classic and pared down. She was a perennial member of the Best Dressed list from the 1950s onwards, and eventually ascended to its Hall of Fame. In 1947 she married Winston Frederick Churchill Guest, who through his maternal great-grandfather was a first cousin once removed of Winston Churchill. The marriage took place at Ernest Hemingway's house in Cuba, and Hemingway served as best man. Since the 18th century, the Guest family had been prominent figures in British politics and business, and Winston Guest was an indoor polo champion. CZ and Winston had 2 children together, Alexander and Cornelia. Cornelia became a popular debutante and subject of media attention, which amused her mother. The children's godparents were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who the Guests frequently entertained. CZ and Winston were part of the international jet set and hunted with the Maharaja of Jaipur in India and General Franco in Spain. Throughout her life, CZ had a passion for horses that began when she was taught to ride by champion riders as a child. She went on to compete across the country and was the queen of horsey high society. She credited the athletic discipline instilled in her from childhood with keeping her grounded. She took on a very hands-on role at her husband's stables in Virginia, managing the running of them and exercising the horses herself as often as she could. Her husband, 14 years her senior, and of the time and class that believed you should only be in the papers for birth, marriage and death, disliked her popularity as a fashion icon, and CZ herself was rather perplexed by it, as she had never intended to become one. Winston Guest was horrified when his wife graced the cover of Time magazine in 1962, with the headline, "A Legend in Her Own Time." After a riding accident in 1976, CZ had to find other things to occupy herself with. She published a gardening book illustrated by her friend Cecil Beaton, and then another called Tiny Green Thumbs, a gardening book for children. Her gardening column in the New York Post was syndicated into 350 national newspapers, and after her husband's death in 1981, she designed a line of cashmere sweaters and later a sportswear line too. She even developed a fragrant insect repellent. CZ's Reserve had saved her from embarrassment when La Cote Basque 1965 was published. She, like Slim, never revealed too much of her life to Truman. Truman admired her elegance and style, but he never got as close with CZ as with his other swans, and she was one of the few leading society figures who did not shun him after the scandal. A New York Times article reflecting on CZ's life said it best. It was an enchanting life, and what wasn't enchanting about it, she had the good manners to keep to herself. She died in 2003 at the age of 83, and is portrayed by Chloe Sevigny in Capote vs. the Swans. The last swan I'll be talking about today is Lee Radziwill, the overshadowed sister of Jacqueline Kennedy. Truman said of Lee, "I love everything about her." Caroline Lee Bouvier was born in New York on March 3, 1933. Her childhood was dominated by the tension and competition between her stockbroker father Jack, who was a heavy drinker, philanderer and ruinous gambler, and her straight-laced socialite mother Janet. The couple separated in 1936, and while Jack attempted to save the marriage, they divorced in 1940, which caused Lee and her older sister Jackie emotional turmoil. Lee suffered from uncontrollable fits of crying, while Jackie constantly rowed with their mother. Jack Bouvier shared a closer bond with his 2 daughters than with anyone else, and they gravitated towards his more loving and indulgent personality as children, which infuriated their mother, who spanked them regularly. The sisters tried to live up to both their parents' expectations, and Lee recalled that for her mother especially, nothing was ever good enough. Lee was her mother's favourite, which only put more pressure on her, while Jackie had the envied position as her father's favourite. Predictably, this led to a lifelong competition between Jackie and Lee. Jackie won ribbon after ribbon at horse riding competitions, got good grades and was more confident. Lee was charming, kind, and quite bright too, but as a child she had no comparative achievements she felt could live up to her sisters. Lee retreated into a world of fantasy and imaginary friends for comfort, but the bond between her and Jackie strengthened when their mother remarried to a wealthy banker called Hugh D. Auchincloss, and the sisters gained 4 step-siblings to contend with. Lee had been chubby all her life, and when she began attending the elite Miss Porter's boarding school in Connecticut, of which Jackie had been a star pupil, she was determined to shed the weight. She lost so much the school insisted she be weighed regularly, and she was often in the nurse's office for other complaints. Ill health would plague her all her life. During their teenage years, Jackie and Lee especially began dressing to impress. Their father encouraged them to stand out from the crowd, while their mother pushed them to fit in, and both pressures weighed heavily on the girls. While Jackie's style is iconic, Lee's classic and chic fashion sense is just as beautiful and timeless. In fact, Lee may have even helped Jackie create her famous style by advising her in choosing designers and styles of clothing, and Lee was most definitely the first of the Bouvier sisters to be known as fashionable. In her teens, Lee found confidence in fashion and on the stage, two things she felt put the spotlight on her, not on Jackie. Lee began acting in school plays, and wherever she went, she dressed up to the nines. In 1950, she graduated school at last, and was given the much-coveted title of Debutante of the Year. Lee never tried to draw attention to herself, and was surprised and thrilled by her own success. Life magazine published a full-page photo of her, and she received numerous fan letters and more press attention. It's difficult to imagine in our modern culture the importance of the debutante tradition in the 1950s. Debs were often featured in the press, and some were even put on the covers of magazines, and they were an idolised ideal for many girls who could only dream of living such a privileged life, filled with beautiful dresses and glittering social events. Lee even received proposals of marriage in her fan mail, all of which she kept and reread over and over again. It must have been a huge boost to her self-esteem. That year, Lee juggled a packed social calendar of dinners, parties and balls with her studies at the Sarah Lawrence School in Bronxville, New York, and visits to the Ivy League schools of Harvard, Yale and Princeton to see her admirers. The foremost of these was the handsome Harvard senior Michael Canfield, 7 years older than Lee, whom she had met when she was 15. He had often come down to visit her at her old school on the weekends, and now they had reached a suitable age to officially date. Michael had been adopted as a baby by publishing executive Cass Canfield and his wife Catherine while they were in London, but his biological parents were rumoured to be George, Duke of Kent, the son of King George V, and socialite Kiki Preston. The Canfields only had one child of their own, and they were told they could not have any more. They also happened to be friends with Kiki Preston's husband. Michael Canfield grew up to be an Anglophile, even perfecting an English accent and wearing tweed suits. Lee and Michael married in 1953, shortly before Jackie's marriage to John F. Kennedy. In between her debut and marriage, Lee dropped out of college and became the assistant to Diana Vreeland, the head of the fashion department at Harper's Bazaar. Lee also travelled to England and Europe multiple times and studied singing in Rome. In the mid-1950s, Michael and Lee moved to London, but their marriage was fraught from the beginning. Michael was apathetic about life and enjoyed drinking. Lee was ambitious about social climbing and desired a life her husband could not afford to give her. Both conducted numerous affairs, and in late 1956 Lee met the man she was to make her second husband. Prince Stanislaw Radziwill, a Polish aristocrat turned real estate developer, and his wife Grace frequented the Canfield social circle, and the four of them even went out on double dates. Michael was probably aware that Lee and Stanislaw had become lovers, but he was still devastated when Lee officially left him in 1958. Grace was completely heartbroken by the unexpected breakup of her marriage, which had been a good one before Lee came into their lives. As an American and something of a social climber, Lee struggled to be accepted in English society, and the biggest faux pas you could make was to break up a marriage, even though affairs were commonplace. Grace became Lee's bitter rival in society. Lee married Prince Radziwill in March of 1959, and their first child Anthony was born in August of the same year. The Radziwills' first year of marriage was a happy one. Lee travelled frequently and collected art. She dined in the best restaurants and gave parties. In 1960, JFK began his presidential campaign, and both Lee and Jackie were pregnant at the same time. The Radziwills came to America for a long visit, and during it Lee was rushed to hospital and gave birth 3 months prematurely to a daughter, Anna Christina, who miraculously survived. Lee suffered terribly from postpartum depression and illness, and as Jackie had experienced many problems with pregnancy and birth, the sisters grew closer while Prince Radziwill proved useful to JFK by appealing to Polish voters in their native language at events across the country. Lee was forced to leave her newborn behind when she went back to England, and she blamed her husband for pressuring her into having another child so soon despite her ill health. Lee refused to sleep with Stanislaw ever again, and they would eventually divorce in 1974. During JFK's presidency, the Radziwills spent a lot of time in the USA. Lee was a great source of support for Jackie as she stepped into her new role as First Lady, and Lee received some of the attention she craved from the press as a fashion icon in her own right, although her newfound fame was nothing compared to Jackie's immense popularity. In 1962, Lee sat down to lunch in Manhattan with Truman Capote, who was still virtually a stranger to her, and despite her usually mysterious and reserved personality, she opened up to him about the deepest parts of her life. Truman had that effect on people. He flattered his swans in specific ways that appealed to their vanity and was a balm to their insecurities. He always managed to be what they needed. After their first lunch together, Truman reported to his friend Cecil Beaton that Lee had confessed her all-consuming jealousy of Jackie and the misery of her marriage. It was especially risky for Lee to speak so candidly. Discretion was the most important virtue to possess as the sister of the First Lady, but she didn't just lack it in relation to Truman. Lee met shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis through her husband, who was good friends with him. The Radzivills often entertained Onassis and his mistress, opera singer Maria Callas, and then Lee began her own affair with Onassis. Prince Radziwill looked the other way and remained friends with Aristotle until his death. To make matters even more complicated, Jackie ended up marrying Onassis in 1968. Jackie actually met her future second husband through Lee, who invited her on Onassis's yacht for a holiday in Greece. Onassis was completely charmed by her and gave her a necklace of diamonds and rubies while he gave Lee some tiny bracelets. This was the ultimate comparison with Jackie, and it crushed Lee. Back in New York, where the Radzivills had taken an apartment, Lee was inseparable with Truman. They were seen together constantly, at restaurants and events. The pair even went on holiday together, and Truman's other society friends began to get jealous. But Lee adored her new friend, who could be a sympathetic ear while she talked about herself for hours. In Truman's eyes, she was not Jackie's sister, but Lee Radziwill, a person in her own right. He encouraged her when she shared her dream of being an actress. When she was going to accept small roles in the theatre and work her way up, Truman got her a top agent and convinced her she needed her stage debut to be in a starring role, and fittingly she played spoiled rich heiress Tracy Lord in the Philadelphia Story, and refused to see any connection between herself and her character. The only good thing about her first performance, as the papers pointed out, was her designer clothes, but nevertheless she continued in her role. Her next role was in a television adaptation of the Gene Tierney movie Laura, where Laura herself would be played by Lee and doesn't appear for most of the story. Truman was supposed to write the script, but got a friend to do most of it, and it was awful. Good actors filled up the rest of the cast to make up for Lee's absolute lack of talent, and the director attempted to improve her acting, but she took so much offence to his criticisms she tried to have him fired. Laura was universally panned by the critics, and that was the end of Lee's acting career. Truman knew talent when he saw it, and could be extremely critical. He also wasn't one to be blinded to people's faults by friendship, so one wonders why he was so encouraging to Lee, when he must have been able to see how horrendous her acting was. Perhaps he found the whole venture amusing. Lee and Truman's next adventure was going on tour with the Rolling Stones in the early 1970s, so Truman could write about it while Lee's new lover, photographer Peter Beard, took the photos. Truman complained that the band played too loudly, and the Stones didn't appreciate his snide humour. He never finished writing the article about the tour. Lee's next failed venture was writing her memoirs. She had a lavish book party at the Four Seasons when the first chapter came out in the Ladies' Home Journal, and received an advance of $250,000, the equivalent of just under $1.5 million in today's money, which she had to pay back when she discovered writing wasn't for her. She had given up on pretty much everything she had ever tried when hard work was required, while Jackie was doing better than ever. She was an editor at Viking Press, having returned to New York a rich woman after Onassis's death. Even Lee's own daughter Tina preferred Jackie. Tina was insecure about being overweight and found it impossible to be around her thin and chic mother, and so she moved in with Jackie instead. Lee, like CZ Guest, stuck by Truman's side in the aftermath of Cote Basque 1965. But 1975 really wasn't Truman's year, and in it he managed to set the ball rolling that would eventually lose him his friendship with Lee, which he now thought of as his closest. He gave a drunken interview where he slandered Gore Vidal, another writer whom Truman loathed. Gore had attended a party at the White House in 1961, where he drank too much and steadied himself by touching Jackie Kennedy's lower back when he nearly fell over. It was an innocent gesture, but JFK's brother Bobby told him to never do it again, which infuriated Gore. Gore complained about this to JFK and was never allowed in the Kennedys' social circle again. In Truman's version of that night, Gore put his arm around Jackie and proceeded to insult her mother, before being forcibly thrown out by a group of men onto the street. Truman said he got this story from Lee. Gore sued Truman for $1 million, which is roughly $5 million in today's money. Lee refused to get involved in the case as the two men publicly slandered each other with vicious wit. Lee told Truman she would give an affidavit in his defense, but she actually gave one stating she never discussed the 1961 party with him. Truman didn't learn the truth of her statement until 1979, when he desperately needed her to testify for him, but she refused to even take his calls. He frantically appealed to gossip columnist Liz Smith to try and reach Lee, and Lee explained to Liz that she was sick of Truman riding on the coattails of her fame, and then she referred to Capote and Vidal by a slur. When Liz told Truman about this, he was utterly devastated, but he did not go quietly. Vidal won the lawsuit, and Truman was determined to shame Lee. He went on the Stanley Seagal Show, a New York talk show, and exposed Lee's jealousy of her sister, her thanklessness for all the support Truman had given her, her plan to marry Aristotle Onassis, and her heartbreak over her photographer lover Peter leaving her. Needless to say, Truman once again only damaged himself, and Lee rose above it all, and never spoke to him again. Lee continued to drift through different career paths, becoming a successful interior decorator for a time, but she always had her struggles. She eventually admitted she was an alcoholic in 1981, and Jackie drove her to her first AA meeting. Lee married again in 1988 to director Herbert Ross. They divorced in 2001, and that same year Lee finally published a memoir called Happy Times. She died in 2019 at the age of 85, and is played by Callista Flockhart in Feud. Truman was advised not to publish Cote Basque 1965. He was warned his swans would hate to see their deepest secrets in print, and to see themselves in stupid, vain and cruel characters, when they had let Truman into their world for decades. His response was that the swans would never recognise themselves because they're too dumb. When Cote Basque 1965 did see the light of day, Truman was in Hollywood, starring in Murder by Death, a comedy where he essentially played himself. He stayed with Joanne Carson, the ex-wife of TV show host Johnny Carson, at her Sunset Boulevard home while it was filmed. Joanne was also portrayed in vulgar fashion in Cote Basque. Her character, Jane Baxter, is also married to a TV host whose cheating has given her an STD. Jane doesn't leave her philandering husband because of dough and identity, as Cote Basque's narrator tells us. Joanne was incredibly insecure and must have been hurt, but she remained friends with Truman nonetheless. His other friends weren't so forgiving. Truman mocked Gloria Vanderbilt for her many marriages by adding every husband's last name to hers in Cote Basque, and Gloria vowed that if she ever came across Truman again, she would spit on him. Babe was hurt, Slim Keith was fuming. Bill Paley's rage was a quiet and calculating kind, and he realised the best way to torture Truman was to act as if his work was boring and unimportant. When Truman called Bill after Babe ignored him, Bill said he had fallen asleep reading Cote Basque, and by the time he awoke, the magazine had been thrown away. When Truman offered to send another copy, Bill disinterestedly replied, "Don't bother, Truman, I'm preoccupied right now. My wife is very ill." Bill's words were perfectly cutting. Truman and his petty gossip were unimportant compared to the fact that Babe was slowly dying. Bill had become affectionate and protective of Babe as her cancer progressed, but she kept him at a distance emotionally. It was too late to fix their marriage. Truman surely anticipated anger and hurt feelings from some of his circle. He probably enjoyed the thought of ruffling a few feathers, but it is clear to me he did not mean to wound them so badly that they never spoke to him again. With Babe Paley especially, he probably wanted her approval. Maybe he thought the Swans would find it hilarious to have their private lives satirised. They always laughed at the awful stories Truman repeated within their circle. How was this any different? Except it was. Finally, they could see the gossip objectively. What each of them had heard about their friends for years was there in writing for the world to see too. They got to see themselves as Truman really observed them. Their petty rivalries and catty remarks looked so much worse in print. And yet, with the exception of Anne Woodward, none of them particularly suffered socially. The downfall was Truman's alone, and oh, what a fool it was. For years he remained convinced that if he could only get in contact with the Swans who had flown far away from him, they would forgive him and he could win their friendship back. This never happened, and he became addicted to drugs and alcohol, with multiple stints in rehab that were often publicised. He found a new crowd at Studio 54, but it was not the same. He tried to write, but that was also not the same as it had been before. On August 25, 1984, Truman Capote died in Joanne Carson's home, and his old nemesis Gore Vidal said his death was a wise career move. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and if you would like me to make a video on the other Swans who were not portrayed in Feud, leave a comment down below. Until next time.